Today, however, we're going to be talking about Brexit. And anyone who's been following this knows it's been fairly chaotic and lots of developments even this morning in what's taking place in the UK. We have with us two experts to talk about it. We have Todd Butler, who I'll be introducing in a minute. He's our Associate Dean, of course, and he's going to give us a historical perspective. But we're going to start with Craig Parsons. Craig Parsons currently serves as a professor and chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Oregon. His research investigates the ideas and institutions that construct today's Europe and how divisive issues like the authority of the European Union affects political parties and democratic representation. Craig's work has been widely published in top journals of political science and comparative politics. His first book, A Certain Idea of Europe, which was published by Cornell University Press, won the International Study Association's Alger Prize for the best book on international organizations. He's also the co-editor of at least 3 other volumes: Constructing the International Economy, published by Cornell University Press; Immigration and the Transformation of Europe, published by the Cambridge University Press; and With Us or Against Us, European Trends in American Perspective, published by Oxford University Press. Craig received his BA from Stanford University and his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Join me now in welcoming Craig Parsons to WHU.
Well, it's a pleasure to be up here up on the Palouse. It's a tall order to talk about Brexit in any amount of time. What I want to flag a couple things. I don't know if there's anybody here who was at the class I appeared in this morning. You'll hear a few things again. All right, well, sorry for repeating myself a little bit. In any case, I've only got a couple interesting things to say. First, let me give you absolute basics, because one thing to expect in any crowd is you don't know much about the EU or Brexit, right? This is super complicated. One of the problems behind Brexit is that people don't know much about the EU. So quick basics, and then make a couple points that I think have received less attention and deserve more. Okay, so the European Union is this extraordinarily strange quasi-federal government over 28 countries, more or less created in the 1950s and gradually given more power and adding more members ever since then. It's built around a single market, right? The sort of crucial idea was that Europeans would end their cycles of war and stimulate growth in their small and medium-sized economies by getting rid of barriers between them. And eventually they added a single currency, the euro, for some of the members, although the British chose not to participate in that. Okay, so you have this extremely strange, there's really nothing quite like it in world history. Although if you're going to say it's like something, you should be thinking of it like a federal government, like the United States. Okay, and I'm actually going to stress a couple things about how it actually has even more power in some ways than the US federal government. Okay, the couple of lesser known points. So if you have been following Brexit at all, you probably, largely rightly, understand it as an anti-globalization, anti-openness political movement, quite similar in its themes to the other big event, the other big vote, earth-shaking vote of 2016, the election of Donald Trump in the United States, okay, the British referendum in 2016. It sounds all sorts of similar themes. And so this guy, Nigel Farage, is the really extraordinarily effective politician who really became the face of the essentially anti-immigrant theme in calling for Britain to reestablish control of its borders. And so if you break down the Brexit vote, who exactly voted for it, how does it break out across pieces of Britain, sure enough, you see that less educated, more rural people, older people tended to vote to leave. These are votes against people who understandably feel threatened by a vast single market, and one in particular that lets a lot of very different people come into their country. And there has been a lot of immigration, especially from Eastern Europe, into Britain as a consequence of the EU, which is extraordinarily open. I'm actually not going to get a chance in these brief remarks to say much about this, but I would love it if someone asked me a question about the EU is actually more open than the United States internally in many, many ways. There are all sorts of barriers. So like if you're a lawyer, it's much easier to do business in a country that your license is recognized in other states in the EU much more easily than it is in the United States. And that's true of plumbers and architects and everybody else you can think of with professional qualifications. They have more unified goods standards. They have open and competitive public procurement, which we do not. There's also all sorts of things in which the United States actually retains more barriers, and the EU has made itself more open. And by the way, I learned a bunch of those things from this man over here, Leif Hoffman, who was a student of mine, is now a professor at Lewis Clarkson College. And his dissertation got me onto that theme. Anyway, we can talk about that more if you'd like, but okay, the EU is really open, thus it makes good sense in a world in which all industrialized countries are seeing reactions against openness and immigration, that people like Nigel Farage and the people who, like him, would want to get out of the EU for that reason, to reestablish sovereignty, control of their borders, decisions about movement of people in particular. Okay, but what has not received enough attention, I think, in talking about Brexit is that it's definitely not just that, and it would not have happened if this theme was not married in a very awkward coalition to another theme, okay, which is a slightly more complicated theme about the EU essentially as a federal government and British objections to just in principle having a federal-like authority over it. Okay, now the person who is deserves most credit or blame or whatever for making this a really powerful theme in contemporary British politics is Margaret Thatcher, the great prime minister of the 1980s, the sort of parallel to Ronald Reagan in the American context. And okay, now again, this is a slightly complicated thing, but what I want to say here is most of you will know that Reagan developed pretty strongly anti-federal government discourse. Like one of his most favorite lines was, what's the scariest thing you can hear is that I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, something like that. And he really meant the federal government, okay? He was a proponent of states' rights, okay? And now remember, the Cold War is going on at that time, right? The big enemy is the worst big government in the world. And so it made lots of sense in American politics to sound the theme of like, what is the worst thing we could possibly have? Big, distant government authority. Okay. Thatcher is sounding those themes also at the same time in British politics. But she has an interesting foil. She has this thing, the developing European Union. It's called the European Community at the time. And it was really adding more powers in the 1980s. And Thatcher gradually, over the course of her career into the early 1990s, becomes more and more opposed to this thing, in very much Reagan-esque terms. Now, what's really strange about this is, of course, both Reagan and Thatcher is the person I'm really focused on, are super free marketeers, right? They're all about market openness. And Thatcher actually broke with a lot of other conservatives who liked what the EU was doing because, as I was just hinting, it is an extraordinarily open zone that has worked very, very hard to facilitate trade and mobility in a way that you'd think a free marketeer would like. Okay, but for Thatcher, what ultimately trumped that, I can't avoid that word. It's a good word, right? Was this notion that it's just unacceptable to have this kind of federal authority over Britain, even if it was mostly doing sort of market opening things. And then what that led to, and this was an interaction I think with a lot of British media especially, was a gradually growing mischaracterization of the EU in British conservative politics and the media. They played up every single story about the EU being anti-market. It gives subsidies, it has onerous regulations and everything, and massively played down what it actually does mostly, which is open borders. And so it got misrepresented in a lot of British politics as a horrible, bureaucratic, anti-market thing, which is really profoundly not what it's like on the ground. Okay. And so so you get this weird coalition that's the story of Brexit. So through all sorts of machinations, you finally get a referendum about this after sort of simmering opposition to the EU for a long period of time. Yes, you have this rising, quite coherent anti-immigrant, anti-globalization hatred of the EU. But the only way it gets to be a referendum, you need the British Conservative Party as an organization to sign on to this. And you needed a bunch of Thatcherite, sort of high-thinking conservatives to tell themselves a story that the EU was not just bad for the losers, if you will, in the little British village, but it was actually bad for global, free trading, open, true conservative principles. Okay, now, I think that story doesn't actually make sense, but it's definitely what they believed, and it's the only way you have to be aware of this to understand. So this is poor Theresa May, right? The unfortunate person who found herself prime minister after the referendum. Here she is standing on a podium shortly after the referendum. A vote that has just been mostly, on the face of it, about reestablishing control of borders. She's standing in front of a podium that says a global Britain. Right? So we are leaving the most open single market ever created by a long shot, okay, in order to break out and be global and have free trade. And there's all this nonsense about Britain, the Brexiteers, like, we're going to sign new free trade agreements. First of all, Britain is a smallish country that is not going to be able to sign particularly good free trade agreements by itself. Okay, the EU is the major force for free trade agreements in the world. Okay, it goes around, negotiates free trade agreements with all the regions in the world. It is prying open markets. It's super open internally. It is simply nuts to get out of the EU in the notion of having global free trade arrangements. It doesn't make any sense. But it is important to see this, because otherwise the anti-immigrant Nigel Farage types wouldn't have been able to swing a referendum without this theme. Okay, that's I'm doing all right here. Okay, that's my first point. There's this weird coalition, and that in and of itself explains why Brexit has gone on so long and been such a mess, because the coalition that formed was fundamentally incoherent, right? It's some people who above all want to close borders, and some people who have a complicated and I think sort of misleading story that we're doing this in order to open borders. And so, big surprise, the government and poor Theresa May, who were supposed to negotiate that, it's like, so what exactly are we trying to do here? It didn't make a lot of sense. Now, the second point, and builds on a couple things that I've hinted at, right, is, okay, so yes, the Brexit is hard to pull off if you have an incoherent coalition that doesn't know what it wants. But secondly, few people appreciate just how far the single market has gone. And if I just hammer on that for a few minutes, you'll understand why it's been really extraordinarily hard to get out of the EU. And a good way to say it, and again, building some on the work of Leif Hoffman back there, is to build a little bit on this point that the EU has gotten rid of a lot of barriers that still exist in the United States. So if you're talking goods, now we do have a fairly national market for goods in the United States. There aren't a ton of barriers, except in some specific areas with special stores like alcoholic beverages and stuff like that, which are very weird. Although there are a fair number, so that we have federal standards or essentially nationally accepted standards in a lot of goods, but not all. So elevators is an example that Life turned up. So this is something, elevators manufacturers make different elevators for different parts of the United States because they're slightly different safety standards, okay, which is great. And nobody wants the feds to come in and impose federal legislation, which would be terribly scary, I guess. Whereas the EU passed the Lifts Directive in 1995, which said, look, anybody who meets these basic standards of safety for elevators are the same. And so now you only have to make one elevator, which lowers costs for consumers, and it makes it much, it increases competition, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. That's one little example, but the basic default rule in American goods law is that if the feds want to, they can certainly impose federal standards on the basis of the Commerce Clause in the Constitution. But even when they do, states can still set higher standards. So California has its own chemicals regulations for 800 chemicals, right? And the whole environmental stuff, EPA is entangled with states' assertion of their rights to set higher standards than what the feds can do. The EU doesn't let you do that. If there's an EU standard, forget it. If something can be sold in one country, it can be sold in another. Okay. Now, once you have that kind of image in your head, now consider if you're a British car parts manufacturer and you got into this thing back in the 1970s, and the EU has been working really hard to make sure there's this seamless market, and to the point that they don't collect information about once something is in the EU, nobody needs to track it, neither the firm itself, other than actually getting something somewhere, nor the government needs to know whether something has moved around in the EU. The EU is one space for these things. Okay, and what that means is if the British government wants to reassert its control over these areas, even if it doesn't actually want to change its regulations on car parts, okay, which it doesn't, right? The Brexiteers did not set out to trash their economic relationship with the continent. And in most cases, they don't want to change the regulations from what the EU has set. They want the right to have their own regulations, okay? But even to have that right implies that you know when something came from somewhere, okay? And that implies a whole lot of change in customs and regulations and what firms do that has basically evaporated. And people don't do this anymore. It's a little bit like if Oregon decided to set a bunch of new standards in some sort of goods area. Neither the firms themselves would necessarily be able to track in at least the more unified parts of the American goods market, nor would the Oregon government have a department that was ready to do that. You need to hire people, you need to create new forms, you just have to track this, right? And so we're talking about a single market that has gone so far that to even reassert the right to control goods, let alone the movement of people and services, will actually require re-endowing the British government with a bunch of administrative apparatus and re-encumbering firms with a bunch of things that they just haven't been doing for decades. Okay. And that's that's why it's so damn hard to work out. Now, I think I'm just going to pass by this. We'll probably come back to it, right? The place this comes up most is in the Irish border. This has been a really big issue. And so that's what it is. None of the Brexiteers set out to create a border there between Northern Ireland. They didn't even think about this, I don't think. And that's also because they didn't want to change most of these regulations. They wanted the right to be able to maybe change some regulations down the line, but they didn't really want to change the regulations. But the right is the crucial thing that will impede easy movement across that border. And it's because the EU has gone so far to actually remove the apparatus that would allow you to do so, that reestablishing even the right to do so is extraordinarily complicated. All right, so once you see those things, you get both, it's a weird coalition, didn't know what it wanted, and it's trying to do something that's actually much harder than it understood.
Okay, great, thanks. So now we understand the problems with Brexit. We have someone who's going to put this in historical perspective, all 800 years of English history, I think. Todd Butler is an associate professor and former chair of the Department of English here at WSU. He currently serves as Associate Dean for Faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences. Todd's research focuses on early modern English literature, religion, and political theory, and particularly on how that period's understanding of the mind informs the nexus between political conflict and literary production. Todd has published extensively in journals of language and cultural studies. Among his many publications is his book, Imagination and Politics in 17th Century England, published by Ashgate Press, which examines how English political writers have historically understood the imagination's role in constructing belief and motivating political action. His current research considers how control over the mind became a crucial marker by which political leaders and thinkers come to debate fundamental questions regarding political subjectivity and sovereignty. So, welcome, Todd.
Hi. Let me first thank Cornell and my colleague up here. I think I'm embodying the intellectual equivalent of the old real estate adage, be the cheapest house in a really good neighborhood. So I want to, rather than investing all these controversies in the present and in everything that's happening on a daily basis, which was really a headache in trying to do this. It would have been nice if they just would have stopped and started up like new changes on Tuesday. That would have been super. I want to go back to the 17th century where things were less complicated. I also don't, in keeping with that, have a PowerPoint slide, but a set of PowerPoints because they didn't have them. But let me. Really what I want to do, if these are the kind of issues that are surrounding Brexit, what I want to talk a little bit about is why the process of getting out or staying in has been so vexed and so complicated and so tortuous in terms of a national political tradition. And in doing so, my basic claim is that the institutional frameworks and impulses that have really heightened the drama around Brexit internally are really shaped, were formed about 400 years ago. And in fact, they were shaped in an intensely domestic conflict that ultimately resulted in civil war. I don't think that will necessarily happen at this point. But let me take you back a little bit to the 1630s in England. Now, what you're seeing in the early part of the 17th century is a rise, broadly writ. And here, the beauty of being a literary historian rather than just a historian is I can be really abusive with history, make all kinds of offhand generalizations that actual historians would break out in hives over. So I will apologize in advance that there are all kinds of exceptions and counterpoints that could be said to what I'm about to overgeneralize on. But what you witness in the 1620s is a rising conflict over a series of kind of potential flashpoints that if you know anything about your American history will sound familiar to you. The question of religion and state religion, specifically the extent to which the Protestant Reformation, via what we would know now as the Anglican Church, is embodied within the state system. Questions of the rights of taxation, who gets to tax, on what grounds, to what extent can Parliament do this. And what happens in 1628 is a breach between Parliament, or members of Parliament, which is a better way to put it, and the King over parliamentary liberties and the liberties of the subject. Charles then promptly, out of frustration, prorogues Parliament, suspends Parliament, and does not call it back into session for more than 11 years. That's called the personal rule of Charles I. He is working all these kind of extra legal, extra judiciary means to raise revenue, but ultimately, because of conflicts with Scotland, which has also begun to play a major role in Brexit, has to call Parliament back into session because, quite frankly, he needs money. And he's run out of all the different kind of customs fees and duties and all kinds of other things that he could impose. And Scotland breaks out into near open revolt, in part over the imposition of a new prayer book on the national church. And so he's got to call Parliament back in to session after more than a decade. Now, if you can imagine Parliament, and what Charles would like them to do is very quickly accede to what he sees as an imperative need for money. And you can imagine after 10 years, Parliament has a long to-do list of things it would rather talk about, starting with the fact that it shouldn't have been prorogued for about 10 years in the first place. That doesn't really particularly go so well. So you have an agenda of a splintered Parliament, many of the members of whom are fundamentally at odds with what the executive wants out of the session. There's a nation that's similarly divided over fundamental issues about finances, about religion, and the escalating conflict that results first in what was termed the Short Parliament. Charles gets basically so aggravated with the course of the Parliament and its insistence that it would rather talk about its own agenda that he suspends it. He tries to basically conduct a war in Scotland, a pacifying war in Scotland that he fails to succeed in. He has to call Parliament back in for what's called the Long Parliament and ultimately explodes into open civil war. Charles gets so frustrated and Parliament gets so frustrated with each other that the country lurches into military conflict. That about 7 years later results in the first formalized trial and execution of a head of state in all of Europe. Charles is tried by a rump element of Parliament, a smaller element of Parliament. He's convicted of crimes of high treason. The actual monarch can be, or the executive can be convicted of treason. He just can't declare other people treasonous. And is executed in front of Whitehall Palace publicly. So that's the background. And so let me tell you a little bit why I think this matters for Brexit. First of all, let me tell you a little bit what the moment is and what it isn't. Brexit is not, I don't think, a prelude to actual civil war in England. Nor do I think that Boris Johnson will be publicly executed.
That would.
I know. There's an emotional sea change that waved over some people here. Oh. That being said, though, it is a rhetorical civil war. And it is a war of words and arguments that is consciously evoking this period of English history. This period of English history is present in people's minds. So, for example, I saw a photograph of a sign at some of the demonstrations outside of Westminster, that someone had a sign that said Charles the First, a little handwritten thing, and it said Boris the Next. And, okay, so maybe that's just an average kind of protester, but you also had someone as Augustus John Major showing up in September and gesturing towards the fact that, especially the prorogation of Parliament, that is the suspension of Parliament, he says openly in an interview, didn't end well for Charles I, and that it shouldn't end well for Boris Johnson. So you've got someone who's conscious of what he's saying, and so what I'm suggesting is the language of history is bleeding into the present. Similarly, there's been some arguments, interestingly, that the actual votes of Brexit within the country map somewhat loosely onto the distinctions between those who supported the king in the 1640s and those who supported Parliament. These are just suggestive enough to get us into trouble. It's not an exact map, although part of northern England was staunchly Catholic. It was one of the things where Charles garnered a lot of his support. Scotland was, well, a real problem for Charles I. It remains a problem today. But I think there is something that's indicative about the 1640s that's reoccurring right now, is that the fact that the English polity, even at the local town, city, county level, is splintered. That you could have at any given point a city having voted to remain, surrounded by a series of smaller islands of people who had voted to leave, or vice versa. And this was absolutely the case during the 1640s. On issues of national importance, you saw people splintering and trying to figure out what to do with a polity that shattered and shattered neighbors from each other. So there are equivalencies. They're not equivalencies, but I think there are resonances that are suggestive. So the three I think that are most important. There are multiple and concurrent crises in what are termed the Three Kingdoms. That is Scotland, Ireland, and England. Charles faced a rebellion in Scotland. He faced ultimately a splintering of the national polity in England and an ongoing civil war in Ireland. We've already seen here Scotland, the PowerPoint of Ireland, the constitutional conflicts that are occurring in England. There was in the 1640s also an emergent print market. This is a time when the printing press comes into its own as a staple of news, an explosion of small broadleafs, all kinds of other pamphlets in a way that maps onto, at least suggestively, the value and the importance of social media, of digital media in distributing opinion regarding Brexit and shaping it, intensifying it. I'm not saying informing necessarily, but shaping and intensifying positions. And a polarization then as consequence of opinion. Now it's hard for us to wrap around, but the rapidity in the 1640s in which people could understand what was finally going on in other places, and the extent to which that the notion of news became a contested issue in and of itself is something that I think is repeating today. How do we understand precisely what is going on with Brexit in the absence of any kind of partisan filters? It's very difficult, and it was difficult then too. But ultimately, the thing I want to highlight is that this English Civil War was not simply a conflict over particular policies about religion, but it was perhaps the first really fundamental English conflict about how England should be ruled. What are the processes that would go about? And it's a question really of parliamentary sovereignty. To what extent can Parliament rule on matters of national importance? And this happened already in 2016 when the rights in Article, I think it's 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon, to initiate the pullout from England. Now, the Treaty of Lisbon, I had to write this down because I don't know this stuff, just simply says in terms of being able to exit Brexit, that any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. Okay, now that begs the question, of course, is what precisely are those constitutional requirements? Now, in the United States, there's a certain level of kind of transparent process in a written constitution. Unfortunately, the English Constitution is developed over a series of decisions, legal and otherwise, that form a kind of unwritten yet culturally significant, politically significant constitution. So figuring out what are the requirements actually matters. And one of the core questions is to what extent Can parliamentary sovereignty, in moments of questions like this, be evaded or transferred or vested in an individual's decision? And one of the initial lawsuits over this in 2017, which was ultimately settled in Parliament's favor, suggested that the exit of Brexit was in fact ultimately a parliamentary decision, or should be a parliamentary decision. There had been some assertion by May and other folks that it was a matter of international law, international treaties, leaving out of a treaty, and therefore it was vested in what was termed the crown prerogatives of the government. We have something similar in the United States about the extent to which the executive can influence foreign policy. That being said, and given exactly what you were talking about, the decision was that exiting the EU would redo so many English statutes, so many English laws, or create and require new ones, that it was fundamentally an encroachment on Parliament's domestic lawmaking procedures. So it's not foreign policy. Ultimately, the decision was in 2017. It's really actually a domestic issue, not because it's a matter of domestic opinion, but because it gets to the heart of Parliament's sovereignty to create and pass laws. And so now then that vests us back into what's so frustrating about the ability to debate or not. And one of the things that I've argued recently is that the 1640s were fundamentally the moment when Parliament came into an understanding of its deliberative prerogative. That is, the prerogative to speak, to talk, to debate was not just an institutional characteristic, but a kind of bulwark and a guarantor of English liberty. The ability to debate in a legislative body, and to debate as long as you want, even though the executive wants something to happen right away. For Charles I, it was the need for money to execute a military campaign against the Scots. Here you've got the sense of an October 31st deadline and the assistance that we're leaving, regardless of whether you'd like to talk about this or not, and a frustration of England's Parliament to want to continue talking, and talking about this. Now, we can talk about the political strategy behind that, whether it's deferring off, exit or not, but most characteristically and most recently, in the last couple of days, Parliament has voted down accepting Boris Johnson's negotiated agreement in favor of waiting until they have all their specific kind of legislation that implements it out and ready to look at and talk about, do we like this and can we add amendments and everything else to it. What you're seeing is the exercise of a deliberative prerogative. And they're waiting on that final decision to leave, arguably, so that they read all the legislation that goes along with it. And this is something that John Bercow, who's the House Speaker, has said over and over again. And I pulled out kind of one of them, which is when Boris Johnson was attempting to prorogue Parliament, that is, to hold off Parliament for about 5 weeks. This is a while back, and resulted in yet another major constitutional lawsuit. And arguably the strategy behind it was to pressure Parliament to leave it without the ability to debate until very close to the October 31st deadline to leave. Bercow explained it as this, that it is, however that is the prorogation, is dressed up, it is blindingly obvious that the purpose of prorogation now would be to stop Parliament debating Brexit and performing its duty in shaping a course for the country. Shutting down Parliament would be offense against the democratic process and the rights of parliamentarians as the people's elected representatives. What's interesting is it's not an offense against the British people, it is offense against the rights of parliamentarians to act. This is precisely one of the flashpoints of the 1640s. What is Parliament allowed to do? And its own sense of self as an institutional body that comes out of it. In fact, there were a couple times, that in the 1630s, the prorogation of Parliament was actually got to the point where it became physically violent. In the last day of the session in 1628, you actually had members of Parliament sitting on the Speaker, holding him down in his chair, So we could not actually close Parliament. You had sergeants of arms banging on the closed door outside of the House of Commons, all because Parliament wanted to pass a series of kind of statements criticizing the monarch. This was actually repeated in September in a version that they didn't hold down John Burke out of that, or zip tie him or something like that. But this was consciously evoked by Labour and some socialist MPs on the floor of Parliament, where they held up signs right around the Speaker's chair saying we were silenced. And then they crossed it out when the Miller decision came in, saying, I guess we've been heard or something like that. But it's all over Twitter. In fact, there are pictures of them saying, and it has hashtag Charles I on it. And so what's really at the core of some element of the debate is the extent to which the actions of an executive can check and deprive Parliament of a fundamental function. And the exercise of that function is vital to a historical understanding accreted over 400 years of what Parliament's supposed to be doing, and its own sense of self as an institutional body that feels itself and its prerogatives under assault. So two kind of gestures towards the future, which I suggest. So the execution of Charles I doesn't solve anything. In fact, what happens is a whole series of kind of constitutional experiments over the 1650s that ultimately result in the restoration of the monarchy in 1661. Similarly, I would suggest, and we were talking about this right beforehand, that whether England stays or goes the reverberations of that will not be settled on the day that, on October 31st, or 30 days from now, or 60 days from now. There's still going to be some question about to what extent is the authority of a prime minister or the authority of an element of Parliament can it claim sovereignty? And that's going to need to be sorted out over the next 10 years. Things like this and kind of constitutional challenges like this do not just end with a kind of particular decision. The second one I'm going to suggest, is a pessimistic one. I'm kind of sorry about that. Is the toxic memory of this debate for the polity. And quite frankly, I think there's echoes of this even in the potential for the impeachment of our own president today, which is that scores were settled over the next 20 years after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. There were continual questions about whether you had been a Cavalier, that is a supporter of Charles I, or a parliamentarian, whether you had been a Catholic or a Protestant, and these scores, this kind of these reference points kept coming up repeatedly to the point of almost public hysteria at times. And I'm going to suggest, even when this is settled, however it's settled, that you will still, for the next 5-10 years, have people wondering about their neighbors, about elements of the kind of political nation. What were you, or who were you? Were you a Brexiteer? Were you a Remainer? And that's going to map out onto some ways that I think, especially with the advent of social media, the ability to quote back to people what they said at any given point, history will be made present repeatedly again, and we're not going to leave this. So that's it.
Okay, all right. So here's about 20 minutes for some Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off. So back when I taught comparative politics, I used to always argue that this could never happen in England. Okay. Because you constitutionally have a system where the executive always has the support of a majority in Parliament. And they have mechanisms like a vote of no confidence, all sorts of other mechanisms to ensure that. If we had that mechanism here, likely that Donald Trump might not be our president right now. But in any case, so what's going on with the British party system that has allowed this fissure between Parliament and the government to occur?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I'll try and jump into that. The key thing to see, I think, is, and it relates to some of what I was saying about Margaret Thatcher's role in sort of recasting the British Conservative Party. So historically, right-left in Britain is probably more similar to right-left in the United States than is true. What right and left mean in various countries varies a lot. But the British have had a substantially market economics dominated right-left difference between the Conservatives and Labour. It's roughly like what we think of as the traditional difference between Republicans and Democrats, because that's one of the things that Trump has scrambled, right? Now it's true in the United States with the story of Donald Trump. It's true with Thatcher and then the EU stuff in Britain that other issues tend to cross-cut the distribution of positions on those classic left-right socioeconomic issues. Okay, so in the United States, there are some so immigration is in many ways a cross-cutting issue. The EU, the authority of the EU has been since the beginning a cross-cutting issue. That there's some free marketeers who thought from the beginning that the EU was fabulous and that this would be great for their whole conservative free marketeer agenda, but others who, given their mix of, they essentially wanted their own national authority to pursue their free marketeer goals and things like that, and Thatcher eventually becomes the real leader of this view, tends to see the EU as terrible. It's somehow going to constrain us from pursuing the right economic policies. And the same is true on the left. You have the left is fragmented over the EU and has been for a very long time. And so the crucial thing to see is that there's a switching point in the late phase of Thatcher's career that then gets reproduced. Thatcher, a phrase I always like to say is that Thatcher is exactly like Obi-Wan Kenobi, far more powerful. If you strike me down, I'll become more powerful than you ever imagined. Thatcher was ultimately deposed, dumped by her own party after being the most powerful prime minister in recent British history. Because she had gone so nuts in speaking against the European Union at the time. And that makes not liking the EU the signature issue of being a true Thatcherite in a way that upgrades this opposition to EU authority and sort of prioritizes that cross-cutting debate over the older conservative dominant issue of free trade per se. And so now it remains super contested, but then in the early 2000s when Tony Blair kills the Conservative Party in a series of elections, they get reduced to a smaller, more conservative remnant, right? Only the most conservative people in the safe districts continue to be elected. And they were a generation, increasingly, of these diehard Thatcherites who had been taught that hating the EU is maybe free marketeer, yeah, maybe, but the really clear thing is you need to hate the EU. And over time, that it actually remains not by any means a majority of the conservative majority, but that becomes a defining issue, such that eventually, when they get the chance through all sorts of then machinations that happen over the time, you get a conservative party that has been hijacked by an issue and in many ways pulled away from some of its fundamental positions. And now it's gonna, however this shakes out, it can't possibly get back to the previous conservative party, I don't know, but it's gonna scramble the system.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So, in light of the fact that there was a lot of misinformation going around as part of the lead up to the Brexit campaign, there are calls for another people's vote on this decision. What are some of the main forces that are preventing that? Because it seems like it would settle a lot of the parliamentary squabbling.
I'm not sure it would, actually. Because of the razor-thin nature of I don't think you'll get a 60-40 vote one way or another. And so I think that's going to be one of the difficulties in settling it, is that it will always be so close. And the investment that any given group of people have in the outcome won't be satisfying. It's almost as if concerns over the U.S. Supreme Court issuing any number of 5-4 decisions against something, as opposed to a 9-0. So the Nixon tapes, for example, were a 9-0 decision. And it was very clear that unanimity was really important. So I think I don't know in terms of actual forces against it, but I think you highlighted actually another answer to Cornell's question, which is parties are struggling with inchoate expressions of direct democracy. That is, we'd like to leave Brexit. And And or we'd like to leave Brexit. I guess that's true for some people. But that's the question on the ballot, not all these kind of sophisticated questions about would you like to actually create your own auto parts rules and everything else like that. And I think that's one of the challenges for a party that seeks to govern, mapped onto an expression of direct democracy or petitioning that is really simplified and emotive in some ways. So, what would you say is preventing?
Yeah, well, I think a bunch of things. I mean, one, so the Labour Party only recently clarified that it's in favor of a second referendum, and it's the major hesitation. So it's divided, right? Its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is himself historically anti-EU, and although he's sort of muddied his own position through all of this, which was maybe wise at certain moments strategically, but what it has done is that the Labour Party has not sort of been a voice pushing in any particular direction. They have really problematic incentives since this EU authority stuff cuts across socioeconomic divides. Labour knows that to win the next election, they need to attract the vote of a lot of people who voted leave in the Brexit referendum. And so that's when they've been, in addition to Jeremy Corbyn being ineffective and problematic, even if it weren't there, they are hamstrung by a set of incentives. Now they are clear that they would like to have a second referendum. But that, and there's that, those machinations, and then just the broader, having a second referendum is democratically problematic, at least at first glance, right? The people were asked, they gave a small answer, but it was an answer. And so anybody who now calls for a second referendum is easily cartooned as the politician who just ignores what the people want and goes off with this elite EU thing, okay? And not enough shift has happened in public opinion to really strongly counter that. I mean, if there was a massive shift in public opinion, such that it was clear that a referendum would go the other way now by a large margin, you could say, okay, look, it's been a sham. We tried this, you voted that, it's a mess. Now everybody has kind of come to their senses, it's legitimate in a democratic sense to have another referendum. And that shift is actually not powerful enough for most politicians to feel comfortable making that argument.
What shift has there been?
It's sort of up and down, but it's like 50, the highest we've seen in terms of pro-Remain. When you ask people if we had another referendum, what would you vote? Is like 54%, I think we've seen. But that,
It was 48.
It was 48, right?
48,
So it's there. I mean, the bets are on that if there's a second referendum, they will vote to Remain if we're posed in that way. However, not enough. Then the politicians who made that happen are going to get killed in the districts that previously voted for leave.
Of course,
right.
Those who want a second referendum, it wouldn't be dissimilar to the first referendum, leave or don't leave. It would be leave or take Boris Johnson's deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stay or take Boris Johnson's deal. So now there's concrete that has some of these things spelled out in it. And so people think that would lead to more people not wanting to leave.
Yeah.
So this might be kind of an open-ended or even borderline unanswerable question, but what do you think would be worse in terms of long-term political consequences? Falling out of the EU without a deal on October 31st because Boris Johnson refused to say no, or the theoretical chance where they have another election, the Lib Dems get elected and do their cancel Brexit without a referendum thing? Which do you think would be worse?
For who?
That's a great question. Yeah, well, for who is the really important way to pose it.
So what are the two choices are
Hard Brexit.
Johnson, hard Brexit
or,
with a deliberate rejection of the kind of safeguards that whether it's the Scottish court or someone else has placed on it, or the Lib Dems win.
Yeah.
I'm going to say the former, actually, because and I'm going to take the unanswerable pass and just say hypothetically thinking about it is that if the Lib Dems win, and that's what I'm resting it on, they at least have some kind of claim to have operated within the nature of parliamentary sovereignty. That is, that they've been able to accumulate enough votes to win. There is a veneer, even if it's just a fig leaf, of having done things the way England always has done things. So the system expects you to do it. But to openly defy a series of kind of fundamental arguments about the expectations of a constitutional order, the balance of power and such, I think has potentially severe consequences outside of Brexit in a way that the other one doesn't.
Maybe I'll add provocatively. Okay, so yeah, hard Brexit is totally disastrous for just about everybody in Britain. Okay, and in addition to the immediate recession it would cause and the problems for Irish dairy farmers who can no longer sell their dairy stuff, I at this point, especially where we're at now, I think it would lead in the next 10 years to the breakup of the United Kingdom. Scotland would leave. I would put some money on that. In addition to having trashed the fundamental legal principles of the UK, so like all.
I like how that comes together.
Yeah, right. Just the gloves are. I don't know what happens exactly internally in British party politics and the rule of law, right? But now let me. Okay, so what's better for Europe and the world? Okay, so in that scenario, it is nicely demonstrated for everyone else that this was a bad idea. Okay, the EU gets a big shot in the arm, actually, and may then pull together in ways that could solve some of its other quite substantial problems. Plus, it gets rid of this problematic player and doesn't have to worry about keeping them in. Because if you, in some way, I don't really want to make this argument that this would be better, but and listen to me don't take too seriously what I'm about to say, but having had the Nazis in the world is why we have the United Nations and why the EU exists. Okay, there are, when bad things really bottom out, there are some good, broad, sometimes transformative results. Okay. Please don't quote. Just like the Nazis were good for the world.
Professor from Oregon.
Okay, but you see what I mean? And
So Boris Johnson.
whereas-
is what you're saying.
yes, I won't go that far. But whereas if so in the second referendum scenario, okay, yes, that's better for Britain definitely, and better for the world broadly. Nonetheless, oh my gosh, that's what Nigel Farage will do best with. Right? Deprived, he is guaranteed of his career for as long as he lives. Right? That part of British nationalism will harden and get more problematic. Britain will continue to be extraordinarily difficult to deal with in the EU overall. So keeping the problem child in is not an easy scenario. Yeah.
So if you're advising the EU, should they give Britain an extension or not?
Yeah.
I think they have to.
Yeah. You do, because then you also have to, I think again, it's this almost kind of rhetorical notion of having done everything you could, having played fair, of having been generous in the face of impetuous temper tantrums at some point, even if you're privately, and maybe I'm just reflecting on being a parent, but at some point, even if you close the door and you look and you just scream in your pillow, or some political version of it, you're still not allowed to throw your 8-year-old out of the house at some point. I mean, I think there is a certain sense that until you're not in, you're part of a state. And I think, again, it would echo in, there will be other difficult moments for the EU, whether it's borders or anything else like that. And in some ways, how the EU acts right now is setting patterns for how it will deal with other potentially recalcitrant members.
That's a question I was going to ask. Are there any other countries in the 28 that are struggling with this, and are they concerned about a domino effect?
They were, but they are not any longer.
Yeah, that's true.
So right when it happened, that the sort of Eurosceptical forces across Europe, which are strong in every country and stronger in the last decade than they've ever been, we're all like, oh boy, we'll do this too. But it's been such a train wreck that it's really, really hard, except for the true extremes, to read this as anything other than a lesson in how not to proceed towards restoring your national sovereignty or something. So someone like Marine Le Pen in France, who was talking about a referendum for a while, has now absolutely walked away from that and talks about working within the EU to reform it and change it. And that's generally true of all but the hardest line and in most places marginal forces. So then there's another good product perhaps of the difficult.
So we have time for one last question.
So going back to the root, the people who voted on this referendum, what exactly was the motives that we can think of? I mean, the one that you described is the loss of control, the loss of national pride. But as I understand it, Britain was doing reasonably well in the EU. Maybe not recently, but since Thatcher, a lot better than they relied on the Commonwealth as their trading partners of favor. So, what other reasons are there?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of it is this historical backdrop, right? I don't know, do you want to maybe speak a little to that and I can add a little more?
I think there is a long historical sense of self as being separate from Europe, being close to but not of, in a way that that Holland, the Dutch Republic, or the Netherlands may understand themselves as European in a kind of way that assuages some of the kind of almost subconscious anxieties that come out of it. So I think that's one of them. The historical division represented by the Channel or somewhere else, that we are distinct from Europe, although we're a part of it. We are on the periphery, and for hundreds of years, actually, England was a backwater for Europe. The Renaissance came late. My field to England, it was kind of already done. The Shakespeare discovered sonnets like 100 years plus after Petrarch, etc. And so I think there's that element that's part of it. Subconscious. I don't know. You want to?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this. So they, so opposition to the EU, or at least skepticism about it, has always been stronger in the UK than most places on the continent. There's, I mean, also the parliamentary sovereignty stuff that you were talking about, right? So the nature of the British system, what comes out of that era is that its defining notion is parliamentary sovereignty in a fairly, like that is the principal sense, without anything like, our crazy checks and balances, it's a more complicated story of what goes on in US government. And in most other polities, the British political system has a fundamental, simple core idea, which is especially antithetical to federalism. It has been very hard to read into British traditional political discourse that it's okay that the EU tells us what to do. Okay? Right. That's an issue everywhere. None of these countries love giving away their national sovereignty, but it's been especially thorny in British politics. So there's a reservoir there of that. Then I think there's this sort of takeover through an odd series of events of one of the major political parties by this leading issue of making anti-EU stuff sort of the litmus test. Just gives a megaphone to mobilize people in that direction. And then immigration. I mean, again, the EU is so open that the most concrete thing that you hear people talking about is immigration from Eastern Europe, which has been very substantial. I mean, so lots. I was telling the class earlier. I was in London in February, and as far as I could tell, every single service person I dealt with in a bar or hotel was from Eastern Europe, without exception, right? And that's exactly what people were objecting to. Like, all the barkeeps in London are Polish now. It's not that I don't like Polish people. They'll caveat that, but this is too much.
Okay, I think unfortunately our time is up, but before I let you go, I have to ask you,
Yes.
so, will there be a Brexit by October 31st, yes or no?
No.
No. Okay. With that, let me remind you all, we have a discussion on gene editing on Thursday at 4:30 here.
And noon on Thursdays, the NEH year.
Yeah.
Also,
That's right, this Thursday.
on this Thursday at noon, the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities will be talking on cultural policy in the 21st century and its relationship to the U.S. Constitution.
That's right. I think that was next Thursday, but I'm glad you remembered.
Oh my God, no.
Where is that one?
That's here in the Foley Institute as well.
Wow.
So please join me now in thanking our guests for listening to